Hey, this is Dominick, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominick and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Bryan. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
Can you believe that we're already at week number 9 of the Building Your Best Self series? We've only got a few weeks left of this conversation. It's been really popular from everything that we've heard from you guys so far. So thank you for letting us know. And today we are going to be equipping you with 12 book ideas to build your best self in 2022. Of course, you don't have to read all 12 of these books. Even if you come away with only 1 or 2 good recommendations that really light your fire, that's a win. And to guide us through this conversation today is a man who's no stranger to the podcast, a friend of the show who comes on every year right around this time of year, where we download his best book ideas for the year ahead, Giovanni Beckford. Now, his episodes tend to be some of our most popular. I'm going to link both of them in the show notes, but the last 2 years he's come on to give us not only his book recommendations, but also how to retain the information that you read or listen to, while you're consuming these books, because so many times we devour this information only to have it spill out of our brains a few weeks later. He had some really, really potent tips, even on just like suggesting which mediums to read the book in, whether it's a physical copy, an audio book, a Kindle book. All of those have different ways of getting into our brains and either staying or dissipating, depending on how you metabolize information. And he has a whole bunch of other really cool tips on how to remember what you read. I'm going to link both of those episodes in the show notes. Today's episode is really kind of a quick, hard-hitting look at 5 books that he would recommend reading for the year ahead. Bryan gives one recommendation that he would want to give to you. And then after that group conversation, I'm going to come in and just do a quick solo dive on 6 books that I would recommend for you that I read this past year that were really powerful in my own personal development journey. So enjoy this shorter, hard-hitting episode on 12 book ideas for building your best self. Welcome to one of our most eagerly anticipated episodes of the calendar year. This is our 3rd annual edition of books that you need to read for the year ahead. This edition is books for the year 2022. And of course, our special guest to lead us through that conversation, a man who has been back on the podcast now for the 3rd time, leading us in the books that we have to read as men going into year 2022. Giovanni Beckford, welcome back to the show, brother.
Thanks for having me on once again. I'm really excited.
Yeah, this is clearly one of our most popular episodes that we do every year. So, this has become an annual tradition. Hopefully we'll be able to do this as far into the future as you will entertain us. Before we get into your book list, and I highly recommend for anyone who hasn't listened to our previous 2 conversations about books to read for the year ahead, I'm going to link both episodes that you've been on, Giovanni, in the show notes, because not only do you offer up the books that we need to read, you offer up some really cool strategies around how to retain the information in the books that we're reading, because that seems to be a problem for many of our listeners is I read the books 3 months later or 3 weeks later, I forget everything I read. So I'll link those in the show notes, must listen episodes. Before we get into your book recommendations, I've got a few of my favorite quotes about books that I wanted to read off to you guys. I think you guys will appreciate these. Giovanni, I want to hear what you think about this first one. Quote by Henry Miller: "A book lying idle on a shelf is wasted ammunition."
I disagree.
Ooh.
Yeah, agreed. That's a ridiculous statement. Probably 98% of a book's life is spent on the shelf.
A book lying idle on a shelf is wasted ammunition. So when I read that, like it's an unread book just sitting there, wasted ammo. Why do you disagree, Giovanni?
Well, I like to think of it as like a book pantry. So it's waiting to be devoured. So there are certain books that you may not be the right time to read. And eventually at some point, that book will rediscover you. And when that happens, it happens.
And if we go back to our very first episode with Giovanni, he went through an entire process of how he prioritizes the books that he decides to read. I now employ that.
Yep.
I mean, it takes 3 or 4 recommendations from someone before I even look at the book. right? And this, like, wasted ammunition, like, maybe it's just the wrong book, period. Maybe that book sucks. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot less good books than there are bad books.
Okay, so Henry Miller, go shove your perspective. A book lying out on their shelf is
Who is Henry Miller? Who is this guy anyways?
author of books.
Of course he is. He's very pro book. I get it.
So here's one from Cicero. Let's see what you guys have to say about this one. A room without books is like a body without a soul.
Also disagree.
I'm going strong disagree again. I think this is a Bryan disagrees episode, everybody. So buckle up. I think there's a lot of things that can bring soul to a room, not just books. Books are great. I love them. They make me feel cozy. So I get the comments. But like Dominick, yes, you have a shitload of books in your place, but you also have plants. You also have crystals. You also have lighting that makes it look, there's just so much more to a room than there is just books. So there's more soul, right, than just books.
So Bryan disagrees with Cicero. Giovanni, what would you have to say?
Well, we have the technology. There's something called Kindle and there are audiobooks. So you don't have to always reserve yourself to books in the physical format. And there definitely can be a more ego-leaning aspect of using books for aesthetics and decoration purposes. So I definitely favor those who show no books but read many books in private.
There it is.
Okay.
Cicero. Who is Cicero anyway?
We
Who is this guy?
are 0 for 2 on quotes so far. Here's one. I feel like we should all be on the same page on this one. I have a magnet of this one on my refrigerator. It says, if you go home with somebody and they don't have books, don't fuck them. That's by John Waters.
You have magnets on your refrigerator? Is that still a thing?
That's still a thing. This was a gift given to me by my friend Lauren. If you go home with somebody and they don't have books, don't fuck them. Agree, disagree?
Also disagree.
What the fuck's going on here, fellas?
Yeah, I'm with you,
You
Giovanni.
explain yourself, Giovanni. This one I need to understand.
Well, because I think there's a big difference between, even beyond that quote, there's the media around the aspect of reading and being a legit reader. And I think there's a boundary where you can have these nuanced opinions of what it actually, the spirit of reading and what it means to read, as opposed to like the signaling and communicating that you're a reader. For a romantic partner, like if someone doesn't read, but they take action and are very observant in life and love to learn in general, that's still okay. But it could also be rolling back to point number 2 about like the person probably reads a lot on Kindle. So you can't judge a book by its cover, as they say.
Okay.
Oh, wow. What a great quote to end the quotes.
No, we've got 2 more quotes.
Fantastic.
We got 2 more quotes. Hang on, because clearly you guys are not loving the ones that I'm putting here. But let's see if this one turns the corner. If you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. And that's Haruki Murakami.
Agreed.
There we go.
Yeah, because even me personally, I tend to try to avoid bestsellers because the act of writing a book, when you're attempting to write for the mass audience, you by definition almost have to write a mediocre book. You have to scale the difficulty down to the average to allow it to be consumed by as wide an audience as possible. And with that, there are trade-offs. You may not be able to write about very controversial topics that majority of people disagree with, or you may be a very niche and obscure topic that most people are not interested in. And so reading broadly and widely in things that are hidden in a random bookstore can give you a hidden perspective and literally be a hidden gem of a book and a hidden thought that is challenging to talk about in public.
Very well said. Bryan, you got anything to add to that?
I don't disagree with that, but I'm going to play the other edge here. So here's the other edge. Dominick, you put out a lot of great material on top 10 books. Like if you're a leader, read this book. If you want mental health, read that book. And like by definition, we're saying that your lists are shit. Like don't read the books on the list because then everybody's reading those.
Untrue. Those are the books that I personally have recommended, and they're not necessarily the books that everyone else is reading. I tend to read a lot of books that a lot of the men in our community are like, I've never heard of that before. And I want to provide exposure to them because they are, like as Giovanni said, they do provide the perspectives that don't get a lot of discussion, that maybe are controversial.
But you're very popular. You're a very popular person. A lot of people are looking at this and saying, you're a market maker.
Oh, stop. But continue. Okay.
That's all I got.
All right. Last quote here. Who's the woman in Game of Thrones who plays Daenerys Targaryen? Emilia Clarke. She said that her father once told her, never trust a man whose TV is bigger than his bookshelf. Never trust a man whose TV is bigger than his bookshelf. Giovanni?
That's complicated for me. I have a pretty big bookshelf, and I do technically have a slide down projector screen, which is on a direct dimensional scale is bigger than my bookshelf. So I think it depends. It depends. It is not always a demonstration of one's value or perspectives. Especially in New York apartments, you can have a situation where you have a big enough wall for a TV, but not enough space for a bookshelf.
Bry?
Since we're talking about aesthetics, I do feel a difference when I walk into a room if there's books and no TV. There's like a natural coziness with like a place with no screens almost. It just feels homier. It feels different. Whereas if there's a giant screen, which look, I love to watch TV, Netflix, everything else as much as anybody else does, but there's a coldness to it. There's a little bit less of a homey vibe. So sure, Amelia Clark, your dad's sounds like a smart guy.
Well, I think there's one piece of guidance I can give to the women listeners who date men. If you go home with a guy and he's got a 70-inch screen TV and the only book on his bookshelf is The Game by Neil Strauss, you might want to pack things up and go the other direction.
Unless you're into the game.
True. Okay, that could be your thing too.
Yeah, then it's a win-win. Yeah.
Thank you for entertaining. I thought you guys would like these quotes a little bit more than apparently you did, but I think that provided at least a spirited conversation. So with that as the backdrop, Giovanni, I know that you tend to walk around at all times with a list of book recommendations that's just ready like a gun out of a holster. But this one is tightly curated for the men of our community, right? Guys who are looking to build their best selves for the year ahead. What's the first book on your list that you would want the men of our community to read to?
So the first book on my list would be Letting Go, The Pathway to Surrender. This book was recommended to me through a very close friend and also a therapist. This book is an emotional encyclopedia, a grand tour throughout all the positive and negative emotions. Negative emotions are not necessarily negative. What it all is a feedback loop process. And sometimes that feedback loop can get out of whack. And when you're going through this emotional journey of healing and learning to accept and surrender negative emotions, it helps to understand their purpose and their place, and as well understand how it can go out of whack. So it talks a lot about guilt, anger, shame, hatred, and it talks about it on a physiological level. Where does it feel in your body? How does it show up in your life, and what sort of effects that it can have? And how can it be positive? How can anger be positive? And one aspect is that it compels you to take action. There are certain times when you need to take an action, and sometimes only anger can do that. And it also talks about emotions as a flow of energy. The energy has to go somewhere. And something like depression can almost transmute itself into other emotions. So depression can act as hatred towards yourself. With my own personal situation, I'm known for not displaying anger as much, but I tend to go through periods of depression. And that was a big wake-up call for me, is how can I find ways to more healthily display anger and aggression so I can let out that energy so that it's stop targeted towards myself.
Great idea. And anger is something that we talk a lot about with men and trying to process it more effectively. So that's a great. And who's the author of Letting Go?
I am unsure with the author, but we can put it up in the notes.
So this is officially now on the list of, it's been recommended 3 times to me. Giovanni, you're the third one. So this is going on my list. And this topic is something that we talk about often, right? That there's intelligence and emotions. And if we can't feel our emotions, we're playing with half a deck. So this seems like a really fundamental book. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Yeah, it's David Hawkins. I knew the book sounded familiar. So we're going to link all of these in the show notes. So great. That's recommendation number 1. Letting Go, The Path to Surrender by David Hawkins. What's number 2?
So Letting Go is a book that you recommended me, actually, and that is Living from a Place of Surrender, The Untethered Soul in Action. And that book, wow, I read that book at the right time, coming from peak depression and wondering why aren't things going the way that I want them to go. And that was the problem. I was expecting things to go the way that I wanted them to go. And so that book really helped me work through the process of release and letting go and relaxing. And I really thoroughly enjoyed The Untethered Soul. That book was immense, deeper understanding of spirituality and its relation to the soul and the spirit. And this book, Living from a Place of Surrender, really helped me to loosen the fuck up and to really take life a little less seriously, but with a lot more intention and purpose.
Giovanni, that book is my all-time number one recommendation of any book I've ever read.
Wow.
What a beautiful time that you picked that book up, because man, like when you're really in it, when you're really struggling, there is nothing. I've gone through that book, I think 3 or 4 times now. And I can tell when I need a little juice there, a little reminder of like what it's like to let go, to surrender, and what that actually means. And what a cool 1-2 punch with your first recommendation, which seems maybe a little more heady, but kind of how does it work scientifically? And then you get Michael Singer coming in with that book and just the spiritual side of it.
Yeah. Do you notice that the first 2 books Giovanni recommended both have the word surrender in the title? And Living from a Place of Surrender by Michael Singer is an audiobook. It's 8 hours on 1 time speed. It'll be the greatest 8-hour investment you will make in your life. And Bryan has listened to 4 or 5 times. I've listened to it probably 5 or 6 times too. It's just like, it's a book you want to listen to over and over. So highly recommend.
Dominick just one up me? He just one up me. What was that? 5 or 6? Oh.
Always got to, man. Always going over the top. All right, man. Giovanni, number 3.
Book number 3 is a book called Scattered Minds: The Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder. So this book was something around a topic that I've avoided or ignored for a very, very long time, but it came to a point in my life in which I had to acknowledge or direct my curiosity to finding out whether I had ADHD. This book was the catalyst for me actually getting diagnosed and taking the test and working with a therapist and psychiatrist to get better. And this book is by Dr. Gabor, who writes a lot about addiction, trauma, as well as attention deficit disorder. And for the longest while, I've been skeptical about ADHD in terms of it's very loosely related to, some of the symptoms are related to burnout. And there's this societal and technological effect, this environmental effect that puts people in an ADHD-like state. And there's a trendiness too of like, oh yeah, I have this, I have that. And so I was very skeptical of it. And this book doesn't focus on like the trouble of attention. It focuses on some of the other underlying or bigger symptoms around emotional regulation issues, memory issues, hypersensitivity to criticism. And it was connected to my people-pleasing tendencies, as well as my rebelliousness and my compulsions in some other areas. Dr. Gabor focuses on the childhood aspect of it, how your upbringing can help influence or trigger certain genes to display these disorders. It talks about child and parent relationship and how the lack of attention growing up as a child could help foster some conditions. And it talks about the wide spectrum and how this is not just one thing that you can label yourself. You have to understand how you have it on a nuanced level. And so for me, I have like a subtype of the inattentive type. So I have trouble paying attention, but how that displays itself is because I have trouble producing dopamine. So I am not paying attention because it's not interesting or intriguing enough. And I tend to just zone out in my head or find something else to keep my attention. But it also explains why I love spinning multiple plates all the time and why I love deadlines, because the rush of a deadline can spike my dopamine levels to keep me like energized and engaged. But it was written with immense empathy and understanding and helped me like start the journey to better understand the condition. I don't like to think of it as an illness. I like to think of it, society's just not ready for you.
Nice. One of my favorite conversations that I had a chance to just sit back and listen to was when you, me, Jay Washington, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, he's in the mastermind community. We went to Washington Square Park and the two of you were talking about ADHD and how so many times like these situations that, you know, say Jay would put himself in that were like dangerous or stressful were just because like he was seeking that dopamine hit, right? And it was just the chemistry of that. And then being able to articulate that and understand why you're making the decisions that you're making leads to more empowered choices. And it was fascinating. So thanks for turning me on to Scattered Minds now by Gabor, because that could be something that I'd be interested in reading too. Thanks, man. Number 4.
So number 4 is a book called The Scout Mindset: The Perils of Defensive Thinking and How to Be Right More Often. And so The Scout Mindset is a book by Julia Galef, and it's an intellectual tour about being curious and being open for questions And instead of operating with a soldier mindset, either kind of just following strict orders or assuming that what you know to be the and only truth, understanding that there can be multiple different perspectives and vantage points, and to continue to seek out information. And it helps you to really internalize the philosophy around looking for answers and becoming a truth seeker.
Does it talk about personality traits at all? I mean, I know when the OCEAN is the acronym, right?
Mm-hmm.
The most tried and true personality assessments, and the O for ocean is openness.
Yes, yeah.
And some people fall on different parts of the scale when it comes to their openness. Does it talk about that at all?
It does talk a little bit about different personality types and different cultural influences that can lead certain categories of individual to be more open-minded and truth-seeking. It takes it a little bit towards the political and social dynamic, where if you are that type, how can you be comfortable leaning into it a lot more in this climate that we're in, where it's hard to have difficult conversations out in public. There's a strong tribal and conformist pull. So it kind of is a book that helps to re-energize the curious and the truth seekers and the open-minded people to stick to the path. Don't kind of prematurely conform and give up your gifts.
So necessary right now. All right. And Giovanni, your fifth and final book.
The final book is called The Intellectual Life, Its Spirits, Conditions, and Methods. And this book is written by someone within the Catholic Church. And so its primary audience are pastors and bishops to lean more not only into their spiritual practice, but an intellectual vocation to keep updated with the modern times. And so it talks about the intellectual journey as a spiritual journey, an integral part of building virtue and being closer to God through seeking truth.
Love that. What caused you to read that book?
So for me, I grew up in a very religious family, but eventually I became more agnostic. So I became less attached to religion. But as I got older, I became more integrated with spirituality. And I've been very curious about various different religions because it's influenced my own personal values and beliefs. But this book in particular, I view being a truth seeker as a philosophical practice, but as well as a lifestyle and a journey. And I was very curious to see of those who've integrated spirituality and religion or the various faith, where there's this dynamic where sometimes faith requires you giving up concrete knowledge, giving up truth. So how do you blend those two worlds of being more scientific oriented, more technology oriented, while also being spiritual and someone who wants to deepen their faith? And so this is the bridge that connects them both. Thinking of it as getting to know God through understanding his creations, his works, yourself, the world at large.
Dude, I really love that, not just in general, but for you. Like, I love that you're reading that book because, gosh, there's this parable that I came across. I think it was in the book Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was The Soul of Money by Lynn Twist. The parable of the condor and something else. I don't know, it was like the eagle and the condor. And the condor symbolized, Western society. The eagle symbolized Eastern society. I may have that backwards, but one group that values the intellectual and achievement and business and, modernization. And then the other group values more the spirituality, the things that can't be measured by science, and how those two groups tend to be bifurcated and operate in silos, and how the world today is asking for that integration of both, right? The shamans do need science. Science do need shamans and does need the spirituality, because there's completeness and integration that we feel when the heart and the mind are connected. And the fact that you're reading that book, just knowing how deep you've been on the intellectual journey for years, that feels like a really powerful next step for you.
I completely agree. I think through my healing, part of my healing has been getting closer to my purpose and doing what I've been self-actualized to do. And I see myself as being a bridge of worlds almost. I have a very broad curiosity and personality. I have many different interests. I have many different friend groups. And the commonality has been being open to understand and integrate both ideas and people and beliefs within myself. And so the spiritual journey and the emotional journey, I think, is going to be some of the primary areas that I lean into in this next chapter of my life.
Yeah, I can, just based on those titles and the quick summaries, we can see the journey that you're on, and it's a familiar one. It's one that I started not that long ago, and I feel like this idea of openness, of understanding, of truth seeking, of religion, of spirituality, of purpose, right? Like these things are so intertwined. And my belief is that no matter what journey we're on, no matter what we're doing here as humans on Earth, we all have like that underlying journey in all of us. So it was almost, I hate to go too cliche, but like red pill versus blue pill, because I grew up religious too. And there it was very much the blue pill. It was like, this is the way, there's one path, and that's all. And quite frankly, that makes life really simple. It also makes it incredibly one-dimensional and sometimes boring. And so seeing like what else is out there, being open to these perspectives, that's why the Scout's Mind makes a whole ton of sense. And then hearing how even the religious establishments are starting to open their eyes a little bit to like, wait a second, like, hold on here. So really cool to hear that, not only the recommendations, but your personal journey behind it.
It's funny you mentioned that, because the last book that I recommended, The Intentional Life, is actually like a red book.
Take the pill.
It's definitely in the red pill territory.
Yeah. I'm going to give one recommendation of a book that I read this year that is really on this topic. And it's called Love Wins by Rob Bell. Rob Bell used to be a pastor of a mega church, I believe in Michigan, but I might have that wrong. Knows the Bible inside and out. He posits in this book and uses scripture to do so. Like Jesus' teachings maybe have been twisted a little bit when it comes to the Christian faith, the Christian, not the faith, but the Christian religion. Yeah. And so he talks through like, what is the message that are actually coming across with Jesus' teaching, as opposed to what we're just, quote, taught growing up. Right? And so this was like a big mind opener for me. And it's just like, it was one of those things when I read it, I'm like, yeah, that feels right.
So Bryan's official book recommendation is Love Wins by Rob Bell. Nice.
You got it.
I'm going to do a quick summary of the books. Number 1, Letting Go, The Path to Surrender by David Hawkins. Number 2, Living from a Place of Surrender, audiobook by Michael Singer. Number 3, Scattered Minds by Gabor Mate. Number 4, The Scout Mindset by Julia Galef. And then number 5, The Intellectual Life. And I didn't get the author on that one.
The Intellectual Life by Antonin Sertillanges.
I'll let you say that. Okay. Yeah. And that's going to be, all this stuff is going to be referenced in the show notes. So you can click and we'll send you right to Amazon if you want to buy those books.
Dominick, something we love to do with Giovanni is something he taught us in the first or second podcast. I can't remember exactly what it was, but the medium with which he consumes this book information, right? We have hardcover books, we have Kindle, right? Digital copy, and then we have audiobook. So Giovanni, go through your top 5, your 5 recommendations, and tell us the best way to consume those books.
Sure. I would preface that the best way is also personal, based on what your listening strengths are, personal preferences. But
no, tell us the way, the only way.
So Scattered Minds, I did have as a physical book. Living from a Place of Surrender, I had as an audiobook. Letting Go, I had as a physical book. Scout Minds, I had as ebook. And The Intellectual Life, I had as a physical book.
Okay, there we have it. And now your bookshelf is larger than your TV. So we're good.
All right, fellas, this is Dominick rolling solo. And like I promised at the beginning of this episode, I'm going to give you a quick hit list of the 6 most impactful books that I read this year. I think I read about 20 of them. And I'm going to start with one that actually doesn't belong in the 6 book list, because I've already spoken about it a number of times on the podcast, but I have to mention it here. If you have not yet read or put on your list to read The Soul of Money by Lynn Twist, you are missing out. It is the single most important book on money that I've ever read, and how to overcome the scarcity mentality, those scarcity blocks that we often have with our relationship to money, that either makes money feel like there's never enough, or like money is something that's dirty, or we have these big times of money coming in, and then periods of scarcity, and then periods of big flow. How to just create a loving and empowered relationship with money, and how it supports your highest mission in the world. Once I recommended that book to the men in the community, about 20 guys gobbled the book up. And I think that they have the same kind of perspective that I have, that it is a must-read book for anyone who's looking to develop and elevate their relationship with money. So I'll link that book in the show notes, even though that doesn't classify for the list of 6. I also, by the way, did an episode, which I'll link in the show notes here, called Money, Sex, and identity. It's about 10 or 15 episodes ago where I gave like a 10-minute deep dive on the soul of money. So you can check that out too. I'll link that in the show notes. All right. Book number 1, Turning Pro by Steven Pressfield. You heard Bryan and I already talk about this 6 or 7 episodes ago in the Building Your Best Self series on the episode called Turning Pro. The concept of that book is turning pro in our lives is a decision that we make internally, a mindset shift to say, I am going to pursue my highest purpose in life, which means I can no longer live as an amateur. I can no longer live as an amateur who settles for comfort, who settles for predictability, who settles for this is the way I've always done things. And the man who turns pro decides to turn pro in every facet of his life. Career, relationships, intimacy, physical well-being, emotional well-being. Now, those areas of your life may not all happen. The change to turn pro may not all happen at once. You kind of have to tackle these one at a time. But the book itself, Turning Pro, is an hour and a half long read that will shake your system to say, I can see in my life where I'm staying an amateur. And by turning pro, I make this mindset shift to go after my highest purpose in life. Highly recommend that book. Book number 2, The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. It's a higher path to spiritual creativity. Now, if you are someone who is a creative, someone who likes to either write or create music or draw or paint, or if you have to be strategic and thoughtful and creative in your business, but you're finding a block, right? You're mentally stuck. This book, The Artist's Way, is a 12-week program of journaling every single morning for 12 weeks that teaches you how to unclog the cobwebs, the crap, the repetitive bullshit that's in your brain to unlock and open up new portals of creativity. After doing that program, after reading that book, some of the stuff that I've learned to create has doubled the size of my Instagram followership. It created this Building Your Best Self series, which has really been well embraced by our community. So a lot of my best ideas have come from reading that book, Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. Book number 3, The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love by Bell Hooks. Now, this is a book, if you want to upgrade your relationship with masculinity, if you want to start to look at what does it mean to be a man, if you've heard the word patriarchy thrown around a gazillion times, but you really don't know what the word patriarchy means, and you don't understand the system that patriarchy creates that suppresses both healthy masculinity and femininity, this is an excellent book to read. Bell Hooks is an author who's dedicated her entire life to feminist theory and activism. And this is like her seminal book for men on masculinity. It's a dense read. It can be emotionally challenging to read at certain times. I had to read one chapter at a time, like 20 pages, and then put it down so I can metabolize it slowly. It is the best book that I've read on understanding the system of patriarchy and how to unwind it in our personal, but also professional lives and in our family lives as well. If you're raising young men in your family, it's a great book to read. Book number 4, The Mamba Mentality, How I Play by Kobe Bryant. So Kobe Bryant, 5-time NBA champion who tragically lost his life, I believe it was February of 2020, right before the pandemic really exploded. You know, Kobe Bryant is one championship behind Michael Jordan, right? Michael Jordan won 6 championships. Kobe won 5. The thing I love about Kobe is, and this is different from MJ, the thing about MJ is he always held himself separate from his teammates, kind of like he knew he was the best, put everyone else down, he demeaned them in a way of trying to rise them up to his level. Kobe had the same level of killer mentality and excellence and discipline. Like no one outworked him on or off the court, but he had a way of connecting and relating to his teammates that called them to a higher level from a deeper and more compassionate place. And one of the things that I've learned about Kobe in his passing, as I've been watching the show, The Shop on HBO Max, which is, I love The Shop. It's LeBron James's show, set in a barbershop where they bring the best athletes in the world, the best performers in the world from TV and movies, and also the best stage performers, musicians in the world. And they talk about things around fame and race and cultural happenings. The women athletes who come on the show who talk effusively about Kobe Bryant and his mentorship in their lives. You know, Kobe had just as big of an impact on people's lives off the court as he did for fans and teammates on the court. And it's such a tragedy that he passed away. But by reading his book, The Mamba Mentality, gave me a lens into the heart, to the discipline, to the commitment this man had, and to his soul, which will continue to live on. And the book, The Mamba Mentality, is an incredible coffee table book. It's got like these beautiful pictures, huge. It's big. It's like a tome that will sit beautifully on your coffee table. So that's book number 4. Book number 5 is Wild Power. Discover the Magic of Your Menstrual Cycle and Awaken the Path to Feminine Power by Alexandra Pope and Sjanie Hugo Wurlitzer. You guys know by now, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, our number 1 most downloaded episode on the podcast still to this day is A Man's Guide to the Menstrual Cycle, where the 2 women who wrote Wild Power, we interviewed them on the podcast. I ended up finally deciding to read that book this year when I was in partnership, when I was still in a relationship. And reading that book with my partner was the most illuminating, I would say, relationship journey I'd ever gone on together with a woman to understand the seasons of her menstrual cycle and to give a voice and a name to the different energies that she felt, the ebbs, the flows, the highs, the lows, and the role that I could play in supporting her through that process and then understanding what she was going through. It deepened our intimacy, our connection, and our communication. Can't recommend the book highly enough. The 6th and final book I'm going to recommend is Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach. And this is a book around mindfulness and how to bring radical acceptance and love to those parts of your inner world that cause you the most amount of distress. The inner critic, anxious moments, depressive moments, where you feel lazy, where you're feeling guilty and shameful, where you want to beat yourself up and where you want to indulge in the self-loathing. And this book is a really thoughtful guide on how to bring love to those parts of yourself where you would normally beat the crap out of yourself. And I read that book during a period of time where I was going through a particularly low point, and it helped buoy me. So Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach. There you have it. Those are our 12 book recommendations. Every single book is listed and linked in the show notes below. Enjoy. Hey, Bryan and I wanted to thank you for the ratings and reviews that you leave us. We read every single one of them, and they're so helpful in helping us to understand what resonates with you and helps us determine which topics that we use in the future. So if you found this episode to be of particular value to you, will you please leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts so that we know that this is the kind of topic you want to hear more about? And it also helps other prospective listeners to figure out where they can dive in first. Thank you.